Hi everyone, and thank you for joining us at this NABS Talk, Your Beautiful Wonkiness, the Art of Developing Creative Resilience. For those of you who aren't so familiar with NABS, we are the support organisation for everyone who is working or who has worked in advertising and media. We offer a range of services which helps to support the wellbeing of you and your colleagues. To find out more about what we do, look at our website, nabs.org.uk. Today, we have an entertaining and thought-provoking talk by artist and writer Steve Chapman. Steve is an artist, writer, speaker, consultant, and coach who is interested in creativity and the human condition. He has spoken around the world on the subject of creativity on stages such as Cannes Lions, TEDx, and has worked with over 80 organisations, supporting them in nurturing the creative spirit and creative well-being of their employees. Over to Steve.
Thank you for having me. I always have those moments when people suddenly show up, and it's no different in the virtual world to reality, where it's like, oh, well, people have actually showed up for this. I better get my act together. But it's always lovely to chat with people from NABS, which I've done a few times now, because I guess we've got a shared interest in this subject matter, not only because NABS is supporting the creative industry, but because you're all human beings. And I called this talk The Art of Creative Resilience for three reasons. And it's very deliberately called The Art of Creative Resilience. And the first is, rather than the science of creative resilience, because then it'd be a very different talk, wouldn't it? But I called it The Art of, because firstly, there are no answers. In the same way that you wouldn't go to a gallery and look at a painting and thinking, what's the tangible takeaway of me looking at this painting? That there are no concrete answers that I'm offering. So I honestly don't have any. The second reason why I called it The Art was because it's probably going to be riddled with contradictions and paradoxes and things that don't quite make sense. And I think that's the magic of artful practice, is it points towards a human experience that's far more complex than we often convince ourselves. And then the third reason is, a lot of what I'm going to say, engage with it as if it's just some exhibits, a number of art exhibits, which are basically philosophies, ideas, questions, practices that I've become really interested in, particularly in 2020, that I've found useful for my own mental and physical well-being. And as was said in the introduction, I describe, if I'm trapped in an elevator and have to do that elevator pitch thing, which I hate, I tend to say I'm interested in creativity and the human condition. And what I mean by that is creativity, that pull that our imagination has towards the novel, to the mysterious, to the creative, and the human condition being that part of us that pulls towards the familiar, the safe and the certain, because we're this weird human creature. And that creates a tension in everyone, in me, in you guys, in society, where we've got this pull towards the novel and the imaginative, and this pull towards the safe and certain. And because of the way we are as creatures, I think that pull towards the safe and certain pretty much always wins, apart from in exceptional circumstances. And I think that's caused us to have a really narrow definition of creativity. So creativity is a thing, is a product, is a service, and particularly in the world that the guys at NABS, or the people that are members of NABS, work, my experience has been that's been an even narrower definition in the creative industry. That's brilliant, because you make amazing work and there's a load of creative geniuses in there, but it potentially means that we sideline creativity for work or for product or for something else. And I remember I went to speak at Cannes Lions in 2017, and I was talking about creativity and shame, I think. And they said to me, you're going to speak on the last day of the conference, which is all about the human side of creativity. And not being from that world, I accidentally blurted out, what the hell are you doing for the rest of the week then? And I learned in Cannes, I met some amazing people, was that most of the people I've spoken to were these amazing creative geniuses, but were overworked and on the edge of burnout, and not seeing that their creative genius could be used to maintain their human resilience. So this talk is really to not explore, is to widen that definition of creativity. There's nothing wrong with a narrow definition, but it's a bit like saying, country and western is the only form of music, or haiku is the only form of poetry. So I want to explore this idea of creativity as an inevitable part of being human, just a natural way in which we engage with the world and make sense of who we are in it. And over the next 40 minutes or so, these are just some ideas that I had about how we might explore this concept of creative resilience as being something just for us, for our mental and physical well-being. And creativity just being something we do to make sense of what it means to be human. And pretty much all of my work does that. That's what all of my artwork, all of my projects are aligned to or focused on. And I will come up with something, or I'll notice something, and I'll come up with a project, an experiment, just to see what happens. So in other words, I do stuff just to see what happens, and then I do more stuff. In fact, this was my 10-year plan that I wrote at the start of 2020, January the 1st at 9 a.m. I remember it. And I'm genuinely serious about this. And what's weird about this plan is, for the year that then unfolds during 2020, this has become incredibly useful. And I think it's a plan for our times, potentially. So here's some examples of some of the projects that I'm talking about, which generally are experiments just to see what it means to be human, just to unravel some of these stuck definitions of creativity. The first one I thought I'd talk about this was years back, possibly 2016, and I called it the imperfect portrait experiment. And it was an experiment to start to see what happens if we challenge our fixed ideas over what good art is or what bad art is. And whilst I'm pretty good at drawing most things, portraits have always been quite scary for me, because I'm scared of the quality of the thing that I'm creating, that the other person may be insulted. And what if I uncover something about them that they don't like? So it's been a no-go zone to me for years. So in 2016, I thought I'd confront this fear by going into London's Trafalgar Square and doing portraits for anyone that wanted them. And I spent the entire day, probably about 7 hours, drawing portraits for tourists, for business people, for anyone that came by. And it was terrifying for about the first 10 minutes. But then when I started to see the reactions, I mean, I love this photo of this lady in the middle. That's not normally the type of reaction you get when you hand someone a portrait. Whenever I've seen an artist hand someone a portrait, the person that sees it does that thing that we all do when we hear poetry and go, oh, yeah. But these people something happened to them. It's like they were full of joy and mystery and, oh my God, what on earth is this? And that reaction just settled me. It just made me see that this was something different we were exploring. And two really interesting things happened. One is I started to embrace the things in my portraiture that I previously regarded as failures, like the little bits that were a bit wonky or the little bits that are out of perspective. Instead of trying to avoid them, I just did more of them and my own style emerged. But the other thing that happened is so many people thought, well, if he's doing portraits in Trafalgar Square, maybe I could do art again. And they left having their idea of what is good and bad art redefined. A project in 2018 was this one that I called Inexpert 2018. And it had the sole objective to create a conference that was the opposite of TED, that was the opposite of most conferences that are maybe accidentally, maybe geared towards making the world seem more certain than it is. Conferences where people go because they want the answer, because we're addicted to the world of experts. So at Inexpert 2018, I hired 16 speakers to give talks on subjects they were passionate about but had no expertise in whatsoever, and hired a 100-seater London theatre, which sold out. And in the foyer of the theatre, I had an Inexpert art exhibition of all bits of art that had gone wrong. And one of my favourite things was my friend Nick Parker, who'd been learning to play the trumpet for just 6 weeks, did all of the music for us. And what happened was Inexpert was a bizarre, moving, funny, confusing, scary, but ultimately human experience. And so many people wrote blogs and articles about it, but all of them couldn't describe it other than it was just an intimate experience of being flawed but willing together in a way that was really human. A project that I've just recently completed is Sound of Silence, which is the world's first silent podcast featuring special guests. Again, a project I didn't know what it was about when I started, but I just thought there's too many podcasts with not much to say. What would the opposite of a podcast be? And so I spent the next 2.5 years recording 100 episodes of silence with special guests. And I met some amazing people. I had some friends on it. I had some people I'd never met before, and I had some of my heroes on it. People like the author Stella Duffy, or comedian Vic Reeves, or the former hostage Terry Waite, all spent 2 minutes in silence with me. In fact, here's a little clip of the silence that I recorded with Eddie Izzard. I hope you enjoyed that. And the final project that I thought I'd share happened earlier this year, where I thought, I wonder what would happen if I encouraged other people to do these weird creative experiments, these creative experiments that have no intention to them other than to explore who we are and the world that we live in. And on Instagram, I created this thing called What the February, which invited people around the world to do a daily weird creative challenge. And as you can see in the little video, these are some of the results of it. And it went way beyond where I thought it would have gone. There was over 800,000 impressions, which I don't know anything about social media. I don't know if that's good or bad, but it's more than 2. And people around the world across 5 continents would take part in these little experiments, and their friends would say to them, "What are you doing? Can I be part of that?" And it just spread. These people doing these weird creative experiments. So much so that What the February is coming back in February next year. So I shared some of those projects just to give a sense of what I do, because I find these narrow labels really limiting. If you describe myself as an artist or a writer or a presenter or a facilitator, none of that stuff would have come out. But the main reason that I wanted to share those examples is the thing that unites all of those projects, and the thing that unites all of my work is that I do it just for me. I do it just for me to find out what happens if I do these things. And I wrote an article recently, a few months ago, that was entitled "Making is My Therapy," because I've come to realize that I make because the process of making helps me in some way. It helps my mental and physical and possibly spiritual well-being. And I never normally analyze what I do, but 2020 and lockdown and being here in the art bunker pretty much every single day made me pause and reflect and think, well, what are the practices, what are the philosophies that underpin all of this that help me? And so what I wanted to share was some of those ideas, some of those concepts. And like I say, engage with them as exhibits. They are things that for me have liberated creativity from this narrow definition that I find also inhibiting. And it also for me has uncovered like this invisible layer of self-awareness that I never realized that I had. So the first exhibit that I thought I'd talk about was this concept, this idea of making just for nice. Because there's a truth that we're taught as we grow up, and I'm not sure what age this shifts, is that creativity has to be for something, or creativity has to be about something. I mean, as a child, we could draw a little picture, and I'm sure that we used to draw when we were children because we were naturally inclined to explore the world through this way. And we never used to look at a child's drawing, or maybe you did. My childhood wasn't like this. And they'd say, well, what's this? Why? What have you done this for? What do you hope to achieve from this? And then at some point we transition, probably at school, into this world that everything has to be about something. And fair enough, if you've got a client that's given you a creative brief, you sort of want to hit that brief. But in terms of engaging with creativity purely for our own mental and physical well-being, it doesn't have to be about anything. And in fact, that having to be about something inhibits creativity as this bridge to exploring unknown parts of ourselves. It seems to me that with the way in which we think about adult learning is flawed. It's like we'll only start to do something if we can fully evaluate it as being worthwhile doing through the things that we already know, through the lenses that we already know. And that's a bit like having a library and thinking, right, I'm going to create the world's best library, but I'm only going to stock it with books that are about books already in the library. And you get a load of books, but the knowledge doesn't really shift. The understanding doesn't shift. So there's a phrase that I learned from the Pennsylvanian Dutch. I didn't literally learn it from the Pennsylvanian Dutch, but it's a phrase that I've learned that has been attributed to the Pennsylvanian Dutch. So Dutch settlers in Pennsylvania. And the phrase is just for nice. And what just for nice means is this. So imagine if in your home you put some flowers on the dining room table. What's the tangible return on investment of that? And it's just for nice. So this exhibit, this practice, this philosophy is really about truly embracing this idea about making and creating just for nice, without any intention, without any purpose, without any objective. I make because I'm interested in what the process of making ends up with, without any objective. And that's a wonderful way of liberating, because we start to uncover parts of ourselves that we don't know. Because if we have too firm an objective, we really limit what we're going to discover about ourselves. So this idea, this practice is about making a mark just to see what happens if you make a mark, making a sound just to see what happens if you make a sound, or making a movement just to see what happens if you make a movement. And I've deliberately avoided the using the terms drawing, singing and dancing there, because again, they're quite loaded. So what happens if you make a mark, or I think it's Linda Barry says it, what happens if you take a line for a walk on a page to see what you discover? And here's an example of, this was from a couple of years ago, a painting that I did. Now, if this was in a gallery, someone may say, oh, I think the artist is saying this. I think this is a bourgeois exploration of neoliberal, blah, 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 blah. But the honest truth is I haven't got a clue what this is about. I have absolutely no idea what this is about. I remember in that moment feeling unsettled, or there was something gnawing away at me. And I had a canvas and some paints and I made some marks, and it ended up like this. And I was just following my instincts and making just for nice. And at the end, I felt weirdly better. Better might be the wrong word, but I felt more settled. I felt more in contact. And this quote sums it up for me, from a South Korean writer called Kim Young-ha. And if there's anything you're going to take from this exhibit, I'd urge you to take this. Kim says, devils come to earth briefly transformed to stop you from being artistic. And they have a magic question: what for? But art is not for anything. Art is the ultimate goal. It saves our souls. And this leads nicely onto the second exhibit, which I've called The Wonderful World Beyond Words, because there's again another adult truth, or something that seems to happen, is if we're lost for words, it's regarded as a bad thing. Now, maybe if you're presenting a scripted radio show, or you're being interviewed live on telly, maybe that might be unhelpful. Or if you're doing the in-flight safety brief, that may be unhelpful. But really, there's a narrow amount of situations where, when we run out of words, it's a problem. Because there's an entire world beyond words. There's an entire world of personal awareness beyond words. So let's do a little experiment. Here's a picture. I'd just like you to look at this picture. I'd just like you to notice your response to this picture. And notice if words arise. So words may arise, but treat them like the clouds in the picture and just let them float off. The words can come back later on, and just explore what's beyond those words. What are the senses? What are the emotions? What are the memories? And again, let go of the words. Let the words gently fly away as you experience this picture. Because you will have an experience of this picture beyond words. And did you really need words to experience this picture? So this is a photograph by my wife. I said I'd put her tag down there because she's a photographer. But did you really need words to experience this picture? I mean, we could easily convince ourselves we did. But if you imagine if you were standing looking at that sunset in real life, you don't need words to have an experience. Yet all too often, if we don't have the words, we will write off the richness of that experience. We'd only need the words if we needed to hand in our homework, if we needed to explain it to someone else, if we needed to justify something to ourselves. So the words are helpful, but they're not essential. So I'm interested in creative practice as being a way to experience these hidden layers of awareness. It's a term that Guy Claxton calls about the unfurling of our experience. That our experience unfurls in a way that's beyond words, and words are just the cherry on top. So I thought I'd explore this further, and to credit some sources, there's a lady called Pat Ogden wrote about this, the core organizers of human experience. And I'll send some notes through for some of these references afterwards. And what I loved about this idea of Pat Ogden's work are these different layers. So for the sake of this talk, for the sake of this way that I'm exploring creativity, let's assume that the seed of our experience starts in our inner body sensation. So those inner body sensations of movement, of heat, of flow, of tightness, of freedom, of restriction, of pulsing, those types of body sensations. And as we tune into those body sensations, either consciously or unconsciously, they give rise to physical impulses. So a movement towards and movement away from, like involuntary movements, all those types of things. And these are really subtle. And those physiological impulses and body sensation then activate our senses. So whatever sense we discern is going to be most helpful in that moment becomes primed. Sight, sound, touch, taste, smell. I think that was 5. And then they give rise to emotions. So the emotions that we feel, and emotions are pretty much the domain of relationships, of our relation to and with something else. And then those emotions finally give rise to the last bit of this sense making in the way that I'm exploring it, which is our cognition, which is our words, which is our language and our logic. And this type of unfurling in this way, in Gestalt psychology, we call bottom-up processing. So allowing the richness of our experience to unfurl from within. And I presented it in this way because it maps nicely onto the development of our human brain. So those lower levels, the sensation, the impulses, the senses map nicely onto the lizard brain, or I think it's called, I can't even remember, it's the triune brain or something like that. That very early part of our development that's associated with fight and flight, finding food and mating. So it's that very primal part of our brain. The emotions part maps nicely onto the next part that developed, being the limbic system, the mammalian brain, because as mammals, relationships are really important to us. And then the cognition maps nicely onto our neocortex, our human brain. And there's nothing wrong with living in our heads. There's nothing wrong with just seeing cognition as the only thing. But we miss out on this entire rich experience. And so this practice, this philosophy of the magical world beyond words, just starts to encourage us to use creative practices, our mark making, our movement making, our sound making, to explore the richness of these hidden layers. And here's another example of something that I did earlier in the year. And again, I don't know, is this good or bad art? I don't really care. But I did this in pastels because I think the medium is really important to me, and pastels are crumbly and tactile, and it stops me being in my head too much. And this just started pretty much tuning into the sensations, and then the movement impulses, and then obviously the senses come in with color and touch, and then I could explore emotions for it without going into cognition. And again, this shifted something in my sense making that I can't explain to you because I don't know what it is. And if we let go of this idea that we have to have words to know that something's done, there's an entire world that we can explore. So rather than thinking if we're lost for words or we can't articulate something, that it's a problem, I encourage you to think in terms of the art of creative resilience, that when the words run out, you've arrived at the edge of magic. You've arrived at the edge of exploring parts of your here and now awareness of self and others in the world that you've maybe not tuned into before. The next exhibit I called Waking the Tiger, because I love this picture of this little tiger, but there's a wonderful book written by a guy called Peter Levine called Waking the Tiger, so hence the influence there. And this really is building on this idea of making just for the sake of making just for nice, and it doesn't have to be articulated, and it can work beyond words. And this idea of waking the tiger grounds everything in our body and talks of the real physiological effect of this work. So one of the things that happens in other higher order mammals, and this is the work of Peter Levine, is when they encounter a threat or a stress or an anxiety, their bodies mobilize. The cortisol and adrenaline mobilizes the same as it does in us, because they don't want to get eaten. But then what happens in the natural world is the chase. So the tiger chasing the impala, the chase enables other higher order mammals to dissipate these chemicals, cortisol and adrenaline. And if the chase doesn't, if they've just been spooked by something else, they will shake. And this is a little clip of my dog shaking, which she does regularly. Now, the clip is of my dog shaking because she just come out of the sea. I tried in vain to record her being traumatized, but it didn't work. But it's the same motion. And you'll see this with dogs. I see it with my dog. She'll encounter something that spooks her, a noise, a sound, another dog, a traffic cone, bizarrely, and you'll see her body tense up. And as soon as she realizes the danger has passed, she will shake. And I never used to understand that. Ducks do it as well. When ducks fight, you see lots of that tigers do it as well, because that shaking motion discharges the chemicals. But what happens with human beings in general is that all sounds a bit stupid to us, I think. I'm not even sure we're aware of how stupid we think it is. And so little things trigger these responses, and we build up cortisol, we build up adrenaline and various other stresses and tensions in our body and bury them. And these lead to all sorts of physical and mental manifestations of stress and anxiety because we're not discharging them. And I'm interested in not only a physical way of discharging these, so exercise may discharge them, there's various other ways you can do it. I'm interested in creativity as a way of discharging this tension that's built up in our body. And I had an example of this from a few years back where I suffered mild PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, because I was first respondent to a road traffic accident in which a child sadly died. And because I was the first aider there, I gave CPR, and in all its gory detail, it was a horrible experience. And whilst it was a horrible and sad experience, I'm quite mentally robust with things like that. And yeah, I wouldn't want it to happen, and it was horrible. But I was generally okay. But what was weird was my body was freaked out. My physiology was completely freaked out. And for days and days and weeks, I could feel adrenaline. I could feel my body was primed, almost as if my body was saying, right, this might happen again at any minute, so we need to be ready. And it was exhausting. And I could imagine this dialogue between my adult sensible self and my natural physical body. I was saying, this is fine. The threat has gone, but my body was holding it. So I spoke with a good friend who was a trauma therapist, and he suggested that I might have mild post PTSD. So I went to work with a therapist, and much of the talking that we did didn't really alleviate any of the physical symptoms. So I said to her, could we do an experiment? Could I make some marks? Could I just do some creative expression to see what happens? It would have been awkward if she said no, but she said yes. And I created 2 images that I'm not going to show today. 2 abstract images that were just making a mark to see what happened. And in a way that I can't explain, over the next couple of days, those physical symptoms dissipated. It was almost as if creating these images exorcised something. It was like I was able to shake off through this creative expression. And this isn't one of the images. This was another one that I did earlier this year, just in that gentle tracking of noticing that something's bothering me, of making marks. And it doesn't even need to be something that's bothering you. It could be a positive thing. Making marks in order just to make marks, to explore what's going on for me right now has an effect. Way beyond trauma, just even for mild stress and mild anxiety. And this is where the world of art therapy is amazing and not really given as much of the credit as I think it's due, because it works in a very different way to talking therapy. But other than trauma, there is an undeniable physical effect of all of this work. And I'm going to draw from my friend Rowan Gray to share this bit. So what Rowan does is he has done loads of work, and I'll put Rowan's website up in a minute. He does lots of work using biometrics and technology to wire people up, to work with them on their resilience. And what's great about measuring the body in this way, and he uses things like heart rate variability monitors, is the body doesn't lie. And he does a lot of this work in the corporate world, and he'll come across a busy executive that says, I work hard and play hard, but I'm fine. I can get by with 2 hours sleep. And they genuinely believe it. And Rowan will wire them up and show them their data and say, you're not, your body's screwed here. You're going to be in real trouble, very soon, or at least later in life. And so it's an undeniable response that Rowan's work gives. So I asked Rowan about 4 or 5 years ago to wire me up, and I had a really busy week. Every day I was in a different city in the UK, which seems like a bizarre fantasy now, having not left here for the last 9 months. And so I wore this heart rate variability monitor for a whole week. And at the end, you get a report. And this isn't the report, this is my drawing of the report. Rowan's reports are much more detailed. And basically, in my very simplistic terms, it shows you when your body's in stress and when your body's in recovery, as well as when you're doing physical activity. And what I mean by stress is not stress as in, oh my God, I'm feeling really stressed, but stress as in you are consuming energy. Recovery being you are recovering energy. So I like to think of it as a profit and loss, where at the end of the day, you may have spent 20 quid's worth of energy, but you've made 20 quid's worth of energy in my simplistic terms. And when I got the graphs back from Rowan, every single one looked like this because it was an incredibly busy week. Stress, 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 consuming energy throughout the day, and then a massive recovery at night, which was great because it meant my profit and loss was good at the end of the day. But Rowan was surprised that I had no recovery during the day, apart from one day. And this is the actual data that you get from Rowan's reports, and his website's down there. So there was one day, you can see the pattern in there. I went for a run in the morning, then it's red, 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 red while I was working. This was a day where I didn't get back home until about 12:30, as you can see. And then there's one little bit that completely baffled me. In the entire week of data, there was just one 15-minute section where there was recovery during the day, which is a complete anomaly for me in that week. And because I kept a detailed diary, I could go and find out what I was doing in those 15 minutes. And I found out that I was just messing about on a guitar just before I went for my run. Not intentionally doing anything. I've got musical instruments laying around all over the place, but just from memory, messing about, playing some notes, seeing what happened. And then when I got these data, it was amazing. It's like my body's in recovery then. Yeah, I think if I had thought I am going to relax by playing the guitar for 15 minutes, it wouldn't have had the same effect. And I'm pretty sure that if I'd been wired up when I created these pieces of artwork, which are just therapeutic pattern-making pieces of artwork, my body would have had the same response. It would have had that response of going into some sort of recovery, which way beyond words, way beyond thinking, is ultimately good for our resilience because it creates that green on those little graphs. A few more of these. Dancing with Demons. This one has been such a help to me personally, because this is a creative exploration of the part of us that despises our creativity, the part of us that wants to keep us small, the part of us that tries to shame ourselves, that part of us that we might call the inner critic or the inner judge or the inner gremlin, or what my friend Simon Caviccia calls the itty bitty shitty committee. And having done inner critic work around the world for the last 10 years or so, I've never came across anyone that hasn't had at least a whisper of their inner critic. And many of us are always still in the grip of that. And these are the types of things that my inner critic will tell me on a regular basis. At the moment, my inner critic is probably saying, everyone's bored, everyone's logged off, you can't see them, so they're not there anymore. But you know the type of thing, you're a fraud, you're an imposter, you will fail, stay small, stay in the shadows, others are so much better, that voice. And I became really interested in this part of myself a number of years ago. And I thought I'd start a investigation, like a CI5 style, MI5 style investigation into it. So I started to journal. I started to write some of the things that my inner critic said. And then I'd start to draw what I thought my inner critic looked like in that moment. And every drawing was slightly different. And the great thing about drawing your inner critic is it's a great way to get to know it, because the moment you start drawing it, your inner critic says, that's a terrible drawing. I look nothing like that. So you get into this nice little symbiotic process. And I was finding this really helpful. So I made a puppet of my inner critic. In Gestalt psychology, we do things that we call two-chair work, which is enabling you to have a bit of separation, to have conversations with different parts of yourself. And a puppet was a creative, playful way that I could start to have conversations with my inner critic, to get to know it, to challenge it on some of the things that it would tell me. And I took that further and I made a mask of my inner critic that meant I could walk and talk and think and feel like it. And I took that mask onto stage. I found the biggest stage I could find. And me and my inner critic gave a talk. And then this final picture is of another puppet that I made, where I did a talk with young people who'd been affected by cancer with Teenage Cancer Trust. And me and my inner critic were able to do this presentation jointly on stage live with each other and answer people's questions. And what I found that this did is, I've never been a fan of a lot of this macho stuff written about the inner critic. And fair enough, it may work for some people, like this slay your inner critic, defeat your inner critic. because for me, that feels like some sort of psychological self-harm. Because the structure of the inner critic, what Freud called the superego, is a part of us that was vital in early life to maintain human connection with our parents or key carers. Because if we don't please others and don't maintain that connection early in life, we're screwed. But the structure stays the same, but the content evolves as we get older. At school, it becomes about fitting in and not getting stuff wrong, and then through work. So I really didn't want to destroy this part of myself, because its ultimate aim was well intended. It just got really distorted. I described it in the TED talk as saying, now my inner critic is still there and it's still a constant voice, but it's like an irritating flatmate who I accept because they pay the rent. So I took this work further and I thought, well, I can't be the only one. So I started getting other people to draw their inner critics. And in the inner critic workshops that Simon Kavickia and I run, we get other people to draw them. And this has resulted in a huge gallery of inner critics that are just bizarre and amazing. Each one is totally unique. And each one, people don't have to, and quite often can't explain what it is. I love this clay one in the top right hand corner, because that the person was saying, this absolutely is my inner critic. And you can sort of, I can feel in my body what that must feel like, but there's no way they could explain that. And also, no matter age, and I've done inner critic work with people in their 90s and with young kids, this one at the bottom right that says, I am bad at spelling. These kids had instant access to this way of expressing their inner critic, which gives us a bit of separation from it, allows us to study it and get to know it better. But the most amazing thing was that even though every image from around the world was uniquely different, the message was pretty much the same, and irrelevant of language as well. Things like, I wouldn't do that if I were you. Don't take risks. You'll fail and look stupid if you try that. Who are you to think that you can do that? And so this practice, this idea, this concept of dancing with demons is fair enough. Do battle, go into battle with your inner critic. But I've found that creativity and our creative practice is a wonderful way of short-circuiting this part of ourselves. It almost like it blows the mind of our inner critic, because it hates creativity, and we're getting to know it for our own creativity in a way that doesn't entirely make sense, but feels wholesome and nutritious. Two more things. This one I've left to the end because it's the most paradoxical and confusing one. So if you're not already confused and baffled and annoyed, you've got no tangible takeaways, this one will seal the deal for you. Because the practice of not knowing, in all of my work, and I think in everything, the practice of not knowing is the foundation of creativity. The practice of not knowing allows us to get closer to our natural state of flow. Because we're predisposed to seek certainty as a species. We're the quest for knowledge, the quest for certainty. But if you look at it philosophically, the more we seek certainty, the greater the capacity we have to experience uncertainty. And one of the things I thought early in COVID was, it wasn't the fact that everything suddenly became uncertain. It was the fact that at some level we were realizing it always had been. It's just the illusion disappeared for a few seconds. So this practice is about the practice of getting good at not knowing, or getting comfortable with not knowing, with letting go of this quest for everything having to be tangible and concrete, and allowing ourselves to experience confusion, to experience emptiness, to experience not knowing without fleeing it. Someone wrote to me the other day and said, I love the idea of not knowing, but I'm always pulled towards action. How would you suggest I resolve this tension? And I just said to them, well, what happens if you regard not knowing as action rather than passive? Because not knowing, if you're in a moment when you don't know, it is an invitation to wonder. It is an invitation to create. It is an invitation to explore. And it may feel unsettling. It's an invitation to experience the strange and unusual. And if you do it in a way that is just safe enough, it can be profound. The French philosopher Luce Irigaray got a wonderful quote that I've been using recently. And she says, the problem of always seeking to make the strange familiar is that we avoid the problem of meeting the stranger and all that the stranger could teach us. So this is an inherently difficult one, because I'm saying this to you And I am also drawn towards the familiar, to my lived experience. So I think the practice here is just to make the center of gravity of not knowing slightly bigger, making everything we do, at least in our creative practice for our own mental and physical well-being, be towards not knowing, knowing that we can easily cycle back to our lived experience. And Nietzsche sums it up brilliantly. Nietzsche describes this type of practice as learning to see the world as strange, because that makes us unhome in the everyday and thereby restores it as a potential place of wonder. And I think that's an incredibly powerful thing, a gift to ourselves, if we can let go of this idea of it having to be about anything or having to hand our homework in. And the final exhibit is this one. And this one is the most important in all of them. And it is to get your own bloody list. This is a load of things that I've sort of put together that I think vaguely help me and work for me. And in presenting them, there's a danger that I fall into the very trap that I'm trying to avoid, of presenting them as a certain formula. What works for me may not work for you, or it may work for you in different ways. This may all be nonsense. This may be all genius. I have no idea. But the most important thing is allow yourself to be stimulated or to rebel against or to embrace some of these ideas, but work out what works for you. Get your own list and experiment with that. Because I'm quite confident nowadays in my not knowing, and the danger is it gets interpreted as some sort of certainty that's to be adopted, that's to be taken seriously. So forget the rest of it, get your own list. And that's it. That's all I wanted to share. Some thoughts, some philosophies, some practices, some ideas, some nonsense, some sense that really is ultimately encouraging us to gently let go of this narrow definition of creativity that we have, of embracing creativity as being a natural part of our human expression and experience of the world. And if nothing else, our creative practice to rescue it from these narrow definitions and use our creative practice to make sense of what it means to be human, or at least to befriend the nonsense of what it means to be human. So thank you for joining me. I'll stop there.